Chapter 13, Rise of Mass Democracy, the chapter of the champion of the common man, Andrew Jackson. So in 1824, we have an election between four men. Now, what's interesting about this election is that all four men were claiming to be from the same political party. If you remember the era of good feelings after the death of the Federalist Party, there was only one party. And so we have four men running from different regions, but they all represented the Republican Party. They included John Quincy Adams from New England, Henry Clay from Kentucky, William Crawford from Georgia, and Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. Uh, because all these men were from the same party, it was a pretty close election. However, Andrew Jackson actually won the most electoral votes and had the highest popular vote. The problem is, if you don't win a majority or over 50% of electoral votes, you don't win the election. So even though Jackson won the electoral and popular vote, he didn't have enough electoral votes to clinch it. And so the tiebreaker goes into Congress. And this is where Jackson claims a, quote, corrupt bargain took place. Henry Clay, being at the bottom of the stack, he decides to make a deal with John Quincy Adams, or at least allegedly did. He made a deal that he would throw all of his support behind Adams if he would make Henry Clay the Secretary of State. And so John Quincy Adams wins the tiebreaker in Congress, even though Jackson had won more votes. And so because of this, Jackson will spend the next 4 years campaigning for himself and undermining John Quincy Adams, leading to the creation of the second political party system in America. So when John Quincy Adams is president, his entire presidency is unfortunately marred by charges of corruption. He had a brilliant record as a politician up to this point, but like his dad, he also didn't have many friends. So Adams works with Henry Clay as what we would call nationalists. They liked Henry Clay's American system, uniting the nation together through the bank, internal improvements, and the tariff. And they wanted to use the federal government to build roads and canals, to create a national university, and they even wanted to build an astronomical observatory. So the issue with this is that many Americans at this point, being mostly frontier farmers, they didn't like the idea of the national government having this much power and also, in their mind, wasting money on things like observatories and universities. And so this alienates John Quincy Adams from the rest of America, or from the general American, because of his national view and also the power of the federal government. Other things that John Quincy Adams does is he does not use the patronage or spoil system, meaning he does not reward his political followers with jobs. Rather, he keeps those that he believed were best. He also antagonizes Westerners by trying to deal fairly with the Cherokees in Georgia and also controlling land speculation. So what you can see from him is that he was not in touch with the common man like Andrew Jackson was, instead favoring more what would be considered more like Federalist policies in early American history. So in 1828, we see an election between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson had spent the last 4 years claiming corruption and saying that John Quincy Adams was an elitist who didn't represent the common man. You can see on these posters, on the one on the right, the man of the people. Power should be derived from the people. So here he is charging that he is the man who represents the common man. John Quincy Adams, what they do is they try to sling a lot of mud towards Andrew Jackson because of his duels. They, in fact, also call out the fact that his wife had been married before him and actually hadn't finalized her divorce from her previous marriage. And so there's a lot of dirty play in this election. However, the election reveals that the nation is split along sectional lines, with Jackson dominating the South and West. Because he is able to yield the power of the, quote, common man, you can see from this map that John Quincy Adams is only able to win elitist and previously Federalist territory in the Northeast, and the rest of the nation, wherever agriculture is dominant, Andrew Jackson easily wins. And so with that happening, Old Hickory becomes president. He's our first president to be from the West, that is beyond the fall line and beyond the Appalachian Mountains where he was born. He's the first nominated at a formal convention in 1832. He's also the second non-college educated president. He's also the first who claims to be born in a log cabin. The reason that is important is because for the next several decades, presidential candidates try to play toward the common man by claiming to have been born in a very homely, frontiers-like setting. So he's just the first to claim that. So the textbook points out that Jackson rose from the masses and shared their ideas, but he was not necessarily one of them. By the time he becomes president, he's quite wealthy, owns a massive plantation, but he could claim he was one of them because of his early humble beginnings. To help drill in the idea that he was one of them, he holds an open party at the White House, allowing farmers and frontiersmen and anyone who wanted to come party with him at the White House. This, of course, wrecks the White House and leads many people to say and fear that the mob will be running the nation with Jackson at the helm. And so the fear of King Mob, as they called it, made people quite afraid of the common man running and ruining everything. So Jackson rewarded his followers with jobs, and this is something a practice we'll see throughout the rest of the 1800s. The use of patronage or the spoil system led to massive abuses and corruption. If you're rewarding people who aren't qualified with jobs just because they supported you, that leads to some serious issues. And under Jackson, we have the first man to actually steal $1 million from the U.S. government because of this system. This gets into one of our major political battles. We have already had, of course, the Missouri Compromise in 1820. The next major political battle is over the tariff. Southerners naturally opposed the idea of the tariff because even though this, quote, Yankee tariff protected manufacturing, it increased the cost of farmers' goods and in general in life. And the more power that we gave to northern governments, many Southerners believed that this would end to a suppression of slavery. And so when the, quote, Tariff of Abominations is passed in 1828, South Carolinians claim that it increases the cost of their living by 25%. So naturally, they begin to fight against it. This Tariff of Abominations is opposed even by the Vice President John C. Calhoun, who secretly writes the South Carolina Exposition. This claimed that South Carolina had the right to nullify the tariff. Now, if you remember, we have Jefferson and Madison trying to nullify the Sedition and Alien Acts in the late 1700s. And so Calhoun is continuing on the idea of states' rights and nullification with this. This creates a standoff between Jackson and the federal government, and even a standoff between Andrew Jackson, the president, and John C. Calhoun, his vice president. Calhoun decides to step down, and he leads South Carolina against Jackson and the federal government in 1832. In 1832, the South Carolina legislature gets enough votes to nullify the tariff inside of their borders. They even threaten to secede from the United States if the government tries to collect the duties or the taxes. So Jackson himself, being a Southerner, hated the tariff, but he hated even more South Carolina defying his authority as president. So he condemns their attempts at nullification. So now this is interesting because Jackson himself will become what we call a Democrat as his party develops, and he overall supports states' rights. However, he does not like the idea of people undermining his own personal authority. So when they nullify the tariff in South Carolina, he threatens to invade and hang all those who are nullifying. So South Carolina is being threatened to be destroyed. And Henry Clay, the political opponent of Jackson, decides that he wants to save South Carolina because he doesn't want Jackson to get a victory. So he forges the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which gradually decreases those rates. It eases the crisis and stops Jackson from invading and seeming like he had won. So what is this in the big picture? Why is this such an important issue? Well, there will be a continual fight between northern manufacturers and farmers across our country over whether the tariff should be high or low. Furthermore, this represents the battle of states' rights versus the federal government. And in this case, it looks like the federal government wins. This fight will continue to be very important as we debate the issue of slavery going into the Civil War. So now we've reached the discussion over Native Americans during Andrew Jackson's presidency. So throughout the last several decades, as Americans have pushed westward, we have several tribes trying their best to adjust in order to make themselves fit in. So these are called the five civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Out of these, the Cherokee had done the most to seem the, quote, most civilized out of all of them. They had accepted Christian missionary schools, giving up some of their own religion and culture to fit in. They created their written legal code so they could also fit in and seem more civilized. And finally, they had even developed their own prosperous cotton plantations, and a few of them even owned slaves, which is not very civilized, but it did make them seem more like the typical American culture. So the Cherokee had gone a long way to seem civilized, and many whites themselves had also done their best to civilize Indians, giving them vocational training, promoting their literacy and agriculture. So when it comes to how to handle Native Americans had been fighting to keep their land, and that's why they had gotten civilized. They thought as Americans pushed westward, if we adapt to their culture, maybe they'll let us stay at home. However, with Jacksonians being committed to expansion, 125,000 were simply standing in their way. Remember, the three Ds to why Indians are defeated and gotten rid of in American territories and eventually put on reservations would be disease, disorganization, and then disposability. All Americans saw Native Americans good for, unfortunately, was their land. So the U.S. government decides to allow them to be moved out of the way. Georgia first tries to force Cherokee off their land, but they're actually blocked by the Supreme Court. Since Jackson and his supporters did not really like that idea, Jackson refuses to enforce the court's decision, allowing Georgia settlers to push on their territory. So this is when Jackson advocates that the only way to save Indians from Americans destroying them is by removing them. And so he passes the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And the enforcement of this policy began what we call the Trail of Tears. With all civilized tribes being moved out, the Cherokee themselves were hurt the hardest, being moved out of that Georgia region in 1835. And when they are forcefully removed, they end up losing about a quarter of their entire population on that harsh, brutal march from East Tennessee and Northwest Georgia into the Oklahoma Indian Territory. So this cruel treatment of Native Americans is remembered, and it really is the biggest black mark on Andrew Jackson's presidency. Some tribes do resist and actually fight. The Seminoles, the Blackhawks, and the Sacs are all examples of Native Americans fighting. However, much like Little Turtle and the Miami Confederacy, uh, the War of 1812 with Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet, and going all the way back to King Philip, unfortunately, a Native American's resistance and fighting only leads to them being forcefully removed even further. So this brings us to the Bank War. Jackson did not hate all banks. However, he believed the Bank of the United States was a private institution with control over metal currency run by elites. Why get rid of it? Well, he believed that it was unconstitutional in its power. Farmers were often mistreated, even though they did a lot for the country. Anytime they could not pay their debts off, they were foreclosed upon and their land resold. And they also believed it was against the American democratic spirit. However, Whigs like Henry Clay and people who viewed the need to build a national economy believed that the bank was essential. And so, with Henry Clay wanting to get rid of Jackson as president, he decides to recharter the bank 4 years early in 1832. He believed that once Congress passed a bill to recharter the bank, if Andrew Jackson vetoed it, then he would use that as a campaign issue. If Jackson did not veto it, well, then that would extend the life of the bank for another 20 years. Naturally, Jackson, being opposed to the bank, vetoes it. And so he, claiming it was unconstitutional, vetoes it, setting up a debate in the election of 1832. So Clay runs against Jackson, believing that everyone understood the necessity of a bank. It was what balanced our economy, what balanced our currency. And so Clay believed that the American people would be behind him. He also had the financial backing behind him because, well, a lot of wealthy people supported the bank and made money from it. And so he believed he would easily defeat Jackson because of the bank issue. Interesting thing about this political election is that we have our first third party, the Anti-Masonic Party. They hated the secret societies, including the Freemasons. Many of them were from New York and New England. And even though they supported the government using moral reform like Whigs eventually will, which is Clay's party, this is an interesting third political party and the first time we have it. Now, as far as other important parts of this election, Clay is soundly defeated, meaning that Americans support Jackson in doing what he wants to do with the bank. Americans simply did not understand, or rather did not buy into the belief that the bank was essential. And so Andrew Jackson sees this as a vote that he can do what he needs to with the Bank of the United States. So without a new charter, the Bank of the United States was going to expire in 1836. However, Jackson wanted to kill it before that. So what he ends up doing is he decides to stop depositing money into the bank and use the money that is currently in the bank to pay their expenses. Basically, over the next 4 years, he slowly drains all funds in its reserves, and the bank slowly dies a long, drawn-out death. So when the Bank of the United States is on its way to its death, he instead begins creating what we called pet banks. These pet banks is where state banks would take over the banking of our nation. Unfortunately, it may not surprise you, Jackson being a supporter of the patronage system, most of those pet banks were actual financial and political supporters of Andrew Jackson himself. Okay, so maybe you're bored with the bank issues. So let's talk about the big picture. The economy without a large bank immediately suffers the effect, and this leads to a collapse in 1837. So without a bank to manage our currency and without a bank to manage inflation, etc., our economy collapses. So even though the common man supported this idea, that doesn't mean it was a good idea, revealing that sometimes populist policies may be what's most popular and even have presidents to support those ideas. This does not necessarily mean that it's the best idea. And so, through the battle over the bank, we have a second political party formed, the Whig Party. The Whigs were made up of men like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster from different areas. They tried to censure Jackson in Congress for killing the bus, but were unsuccessful. What is the Whig platform? Well, they support Clay's American system. Some of them support states' rights. Some of them are conservatives who simply want government involvement in internal improvements. If you look at the end of your chapter outline, you'll see a breakdown of the two political parties. One of the main things I want you to see is the Whig Party platform is quite broad, and that's because a lot of people only join the Whig Party because they hate Andrew Jackson. So really, it's more of a coalition against Andrew Jackson than it is a cohesive force at this point. In 1836, since people loved Andrew Jackson so much and the economy had yet to falter, Andrew Jackson chooses Martin Van Buren to be his successor. The Whigs tried to recreate 1824 by actually pushing out several candidates. They were hoping that the regions would be divided, and that would allow them to, go back into Congress and win that way. Unfortunately for them, because the Democrats were so well organized around Andrew Jackson and his chosen man, Martin Van Buren, Martin Van Buren becomes the first machine-made candidate to win the president. So when he becomes president, you can summarize this entire slide here by saying his chance of doing anything successful as president were ruined by the Panic of 1837. By Andrew Jackson killing the Bank of the United States and creating this economic crisis, this ends any chance Martin Van Buren has of being a successful president and of, instilling and doing anything he really wanted to. So this brings us to depression of the independent treasury, a continued debate over the national bank. Basically, Martin Van Buren wanted to completely separate the bank from the government. However, the Whigs and Henry Clay and his people will constantly fight to get a bank created. And so we have a long battle over the banking system of America. This fight lasts all the way until a network of national banks are created during the Civil War. But even that is short-lived. It's not until the 19 teens under Woodrow Wilson that we'll create the Federal Reserve System and have a permanent federal banking institution. And this brings us to the issue of Texas. So Texas had been slowly filling with American citizens for quite a while. In 1821, Mexico won its independence. So the reason why Americans were allowed in Mexico is Mexico wanted to settle the region, to make it profitable and to make some money and also have agriculture for their country. So when Stephen Austin is granted the ability, Stephen Austin being an American, to move into Mexico, he and anyone who came had to become Roman Catholics. They didn't mind that because, you can be a Roman Catholic by word and still make a good profit and have a massive amount of land. By 1835, Americans began to swarm Mexico, and 30,000 Americans lived in the territory. Earlier than that, Mexico began to realize this issue, and they also wanted to try to leave land for their own people. And so they began banning the importation of slaves to help discourage Americans from moving in. And then they began restricting American immigration. So in 1833, Stephen Austin goes to negotiate with the dictator, Santa Anna. But because Santa Anna was a rather cruel dictator who could care less about the American settlers, he imprisons Stephen Austin during these negotiations. As tensions continue to rise between Americans who continue to grow and take over the area, Santa Anna removes all of their rights and begins raising an army to suppress them. This leads to the Lone Star Rebellion of Texans, declaring their independence in 1836 and naming Sam Houston as their commander-in-chief. Santa Anna naturally marches on them and decides to punish them for trying to declare independence. You have probably heard of the Battle of the Alamo, where the Texans are eliminated to a single person who's allowed to go and tell everyone of it. And the battle cry, remember the Alamo. But the Battle of Goliad, Santa Anna also defeats the Americans. And when they surrender, he slaughters many of the people who had thought that they would receive, imprisonment instead of death. So remember the Goliad and remember the Alamo. Both those battles fire up American supporters, causing many to swarm to support Sam Houston and the Texans' cause. So the Battle of San Jacinto, that Santa Anna is defeated while his soldiers were taking a siesta or a nap. And so after his defeat, Santa Anna is forced to sign two treaties. He's forced to withdraw his troops from the area, and he has to recognize the Rio Grande as the boundary of a new country called Texas. Now you may be wondering, why is Texas not immediately an American state? That's because even though Jackson did give official recognition to Texas as an independent entity, he knew that annexing the territory would be a bad idea. The Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, had left us with the issue of slavery. If he allows Texas into our nation, that is another slave state, and that would ruin the balance of slave and free states, and thus creating possible division. So Jackson does not annex or bring Texas into America because of the issue of slavery. So at the end of Martin Van Buren's presidency, we have Texas that is free, and we have Martin Van Buren still reeling from the Panic of 1837. And so the election comes to the Whigs nominating William Henry Harrison. Now, you remember him because he was a war hero. He won the Battle of Tippecanoe against the Prophet and then also defeats Tecumseh in the War of 1812. And so William Henry Harrison is chosen because he was, well, a general who everyone knew and would support. So his running mate is a guy named John Tyler, who we will cover in more detail in a future chapter. But he was from the South, thus solidifying William Henry Harrison from Ohio, and Tyler, being a Southerner, a good chance of winning the presidency. Note that William Henry Harrison also claims he was born in a log cabin. Even better, because they were going to ride the coattails of his success as a general, they did not have an official platform. No bank to make people get mad about that issue, no economic ideas, nothing about slavery, nothing about free territory, simply, hey, I won a couple battles, don't you love me? And so William Henry Harrison is able to defeat Martin Van Buren, and the Whigs have their first president. So in this election, what we realize is there is a major push towards populist Democratic votes. In other words, if you made yourself out to be wealthy or prestigious, or you supported things like the bank, or you supported universities or observatories, that's bad. You have to appeal to the common man. If you go back and look at that map that Andrew Jackson won, it's clear that frontiersmen and farmers had control over the voting process. And so even those who supported ideas like the American system or even Hamilton's BFAT system, those financial programs are not popular with commoners. And so they had to shift their votes to the common man on the frontier. So with the creation of the Whig Party and their success, this launches us into the true two-party system. Jefferson's party had absorbed the Federalists, and so the first political party system of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans had disappeared for a while. And most still back then had viewed parties as dangerous. However, by the 1830s, with Jackson developing his own political party and even having a national nominating convention for himself in 1832 and Martin Van Buren in 1836, the opposition to him, developed by the Whigs, shows that we now have two different parties and an acceptance of national parties as an acceptable thing. So the true two-party system forms, and after this, the Jacksonians become the Democrats. The Whigs, they'll have issues with slavery in the 1840s and 50s, and they'll eventually develop into the Republicans. And so we have the true two-party permanent system established. And today, I'm recording this the day after the 2020 election, and guess what? We still have the Republicans and the Democrats controlling our political process. So this has been a wrap-up of the chapter about Jacksonian democracy, the expansion of the common man's control over the political process as we see not only the election of Jackson, but also the death of the Bank of the United States. Hopefully you have learned a good bit here. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message. That is all. Have a great day.